All right. Today we're going to break down a set of legal and forensic documents that, well, they present a really significant challenge to the official narrative of 9/11. This explainer is all about looking directly at the arguments laid out in what the source material calls the 9/11 Malfeasance Report. So let's get right into it. And right out of the gate, the source material opens with this incredibly powerful claim. It basically asserts that the story most of us know, well, it's contradicted when you take a really rigorous look at the physical evidence. This quote, it really sets the stage for the deep investigative dive that follows. So, our goal in this explainer is to really unpack the main arguments from these documents. And they're not small claims. They allege everything from, systemic failure and willful negligence all the way to deliberate obstruction of justice. It's a lot to cover. Okay, so first up, the report dives right into the physical evidence, specifically what was going on with the collapse of the World Trade Center towers. This is really where the core of its scientific case begins. So right away, we see this huge point of disagreement. On one side, you have the official theory from NEST, right? They talk about a fire-induced progressive collapse. But then on the other side, these source documents argue that the sheer speed and the way the collapses happened, it just doesn't line up with that model. They suggest a different, much more energetic mechanism had to be at play. And that brings us to the question on this slide. The report then pivots to what it calls the most overt anomaly of the entire day, the collapse of World Trade Center Building 7. I mean, we're talking about a 47-story skyscraper that completely collapsed, and it was never even hit by a plane. Let's just focus on this number for a second, 2.25 seconds. That's not just some random figure. That's how long NIST's own data confirms WTC-7 was an absolute freefall. Now, according to the report, for something to be in freefall like that, it means all of its support has to be gone. In this case, that would mean all 82 support columns had to be kicked out from under it at the exact same time across an 8-story section. It's a pretty startling claim. But that's not all. The report also points to a whole bunch of other physical evidence that it claims was just willfully ignored by the official investigation. We're talking about numerous witness reports of molten metal, like rivers of molten steel. Then there's the discovery of these tiny iron-rich microspheres in the dust, which, require temperatures way hotter than any office fire could produce. And probably the most controversial claim, the identification of what the report calls unreacted military-grade incendiary material found right there in the dust. So, with all those questions about the physical evidence just sitting there, the next part of the report's case shifts gears a little. It focuses on how the crime scene itself was handled. And it makes a very serious allegation that key evidence was deliberately destroyed. Now, to really get the gravity of what this report is accusing, you have to understand this legal term, spoliation of evidence. It's a fancy way of saying someone intentionally destroyed evidence relevant to a case. And the report basically builds its entire argument for obstruction of justice around this one concept. So how did this happen? Well, this slide really gets to the core of that claim. The report details how hundreds of thousands of tons of structural steel, the single most crucial piece of evidence for understanding the collapses, was just rapidly sold off and shipped overseas to scrap dealers. I mean, within weeks. The report argues this wasn't just some oversight or a violation of investigative protocols. It was a felony, an act of evidence destruction on an absolutely massive scale. And the consequence of that? Well, according to the source, it was absolutely profound. It basically made it impossible for any independent team to come in and verify the official collapse theory. Think about it. The report claims this forced NIST to base its entire investigation on a tiny, legally compromised sample, just 236 pieces of steel out of more than 200,000 tons. The primary evidence was just gone. All right, so the report then shifts its focus again. We've talked about physical evidence, we've talked about the crime scene. Now it's looking at procedural failures, specifically the alleged breakdown in intelligence sharing and the military response on the day of the attacks. Now, the documents lay out this timeline, and the key argument here is that these weren't just a series of isolated mistakes. The source presents it as a pattern of systemic obstruction. You've got the Phoenix memo warning about flight school training. You have the president's daily brief, literally titled Bin Laden Determined to Strike in U.S., and then the claim that the CIA was withholding crucial intel from the FBI. The report's conclusion from all this? That it points to willful negligence, not just simple incompetence. Okay, and this comparison really drives home the report's claims about the air defense failure. So standard protocol is simple. A plane goes off course, NORAD scrambles fighter jets in like 6 to 10 minutes. That's the textbook response. But on 9/11, the source documents allege four consecutive failures over 101 minutes, with 0 interceptions. The report says this breakdown was so profound that it calls the entire command and control structure into question.
So you have to ask, why? How does a failure like that even happen? Well, the report alleges that on that exact morning, there were multiple concurrent military exercises going on. One was called Vigilant Guardian, and these exercises reportedly put phantom blips on the radar screens, creating a fog of war that, according to the source, deliberately confused the whole operational picture and completely paralyzed a standard response to the real hijackings.
Okay, this brings us to the final major section of the report's case, and it's a big one. It follows the money trail. It's an examination of financial anomalies that it claims point directly to criminal foreknowledge of the attacks. So what are we talking about here? Well, the report details a really unusual spike in what are called put options. Now, a put option is basically a bet that a company's stock price is about to tank. And these bets were placed on the specific airlines and the specific companies in the World Trade Center that were hit on 9/11. Now, the official investigation looked at these and dismissed them as routine, but the source document argues that their timing and sophistication are anything but routine, that they're actually significant evidence of foreknowledge. And the report's conclusion on this is pretty blunt. It says that the failure to aggressively go after the people who made millions from these trades, that wasn't just an oversight. The source calls it a deliberate closing of an investigative pathway, a path that could have potentially exposed a much wider network. And here's where the financial trail connects right back to that physical anomaly we talked about earlier, WTC7. The report points out let's call it a convenient fact. The SEC's primary investigation files for major corporate fraud cases were housed in, you guessed it, WTC7. And every single one of those files was destroyed when the building came down. So, to bring this all together, this quote from the source documents really encapsulates their entire argument. When you combine all the evidence they present, the structural, the procedural, and the financial, they contend it paints a picture not of a simple failure, but of a deliberate effort to stand down and obstruct a full, transparent investigation. So, in the end, the documents we've just walked through leave us with this one really fundamental question. They present a case built on what they claim is contradictory physical evidence and serious procedural malfeasance. And what that does is it forces a really difficult conversation about how history is written and ultimately how it's validated.